Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Hamid and today I'm excited to bring you a much anticipated feature in the new ORION release of GVERSE GeoGraphix. It features our latest innovation, the auto tracker for log digitization. We launched our log digitization in 2022 and the response was overwhelming. You loved it, so did we, but there was one persistent question. Is there an auto tracker? Now I'm thrilled to announce that the answer is a resounding yes. Our new auto tracker is a game changer for your log digitization needs. It can identify and track log curves even in some very tricky raster images. It leverages machine learning to differentiate between grid lines and curves. It can handle overlapping curves and even tracks broken lines, with dashes and dots, and does it really well. So let's dive into it. I've selected a few real-world logs to demonstrate the tracker's capabilities. As you all know, real-world data is rarely as polished as demo datasets. So today I want to show you our tracker in action, dealing with the kind of data you encounter every day. For those of you who are new to our digitizing workflow, it's pretty straightforward. I have the depth registration application open here. The well you see here has a couple of image files associated with it. They are depth registered. And let's say to digitize this gamma ray curve, I will go down to my log digitization panel down here on the bottom left and turn that on. Now we work off of straight-in images. It kind of zooms into the image that you have. The first thing I have to do is I have to define the edges of my track that contains the curve that I'm looking to digitize. So I have my curve scale out here, so I can see this is the gamma ray curve. It goes from like 0 to 100 and wraps around from 100 to 200. So let's go all the way back to the top and define our edges. So I'm going to define this as my left edge. Just click here. It shows up with a line. I can give it a value of 0 because that's the left edge of my track. OK here, do the same thing at the right edge, define a line here. That's going to be my right edge of the track. This track contains my gamma ray curve. This value is 100. So now I have these two lines defining the edges of my track. I know the value at each of these lines, and I know that the track is linear. It could be a logarithmic, like if we were digitizing this resistivity curve, we choose a logarithmic track type. So this is linear, and then it's basically simpler interpolation. Wherever I place my mouse, I know the exact value. In fact, you can read that value down here as well. I know the exact value I fall at between these two curves. And then when I want to digitize, I'll turn on one of my digitizing modes. We've got a couple of different modes. I like the drag mode, which I can just kind of drag my mouse along the curve, and this is my curve being digitized. Now we do have like a little bit of a wraparound here, which we'll address in a second. Let's just kind of keep going down here, digitizing our curve as we go, and that's basically it. This is my curve being digitized. Now when I have a wraparound, to handle that, I can change my wrap scale to 100 to 200. So one order wrap up, we can go further up as well. But then the other process is just the same. Just kind of go ahead here and digitize that curve. And that basically puts this little piece of curve right over here for all practical purposes. So this point here will be connected to this point, and you'll get this little peak kind of going through on the other side of the curve. And that's basically it. Once you have it digitized, you can choose a curve set, an existing curve set, create a new one, give it a curve name, and then push that curve into the database. Now we've only done like 100 feet of curve, and this is a really long curve. I don't know about you, this is not really exciting. Me spending an entire afternoon just kind of tracing the log curve. And this is where the auto tracker really elevates this workflow. So the auto tracker is basically just another mode for digitizing your log curve, right? It lives in the digitizing toolbox right here. Let me change my scale back to the regular scale. When you launch it, you're presented with this configuration dialog. And perhaps the most important setting here is our grid line removal options, because the tracker is basically, you're inputting 2 points. It's trying to find the best path along this log curve. If you have grid lines on your raster image, which almost all rasters do, that can give it alternate paths between the 2 points you're actually trying to track. So instead of following the curve as it's supposed to, it may see value in following one of these grid lines, depending on what algorithm you're using, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it might take off on one of these vertical lines and just keep going down until it intersects the curve again. It might take off one of these horizontal lines. Because those grid lines are there, it's very hard for the tracker to know what's the curve, what's the grid line. So it is imperative that before you start tracking, you get rid, or you inform the tracker of where those horizontal lines fall. Now we have a couple of different options to do it. You could do it purely manually, so you could actually go in and manually select where your vertical lines are. It's a little more difficult to do manually select horizontal lines because there's just so many of them, but you could give them a depth interval. So if you have a line every 2 feet, you could say, hey, draw a horizontal line every 2 feet. So you could do it purely manually this way, or you could use one of our image processing algorithms to automatically detect them as well. Process the image, figure out where the vertical lines fall, where the horizontal lines fall. So you could go that route, or you could use a pre-trained machine learning model, which has been trained on hundreds of thousands of images to teach it to differentiate, using machine learning to teach our tracker to differentiate between the background grid, the horizontal and vertical lines that make up the grid, and the actual curve data itself. So we've trained the model on there. It's all information is in there, and if we use this option, the tracker will be able to identify where those horizontal and vertical grid lines fall, and then basically ignore them and just try to follow the curve. In fact, let me kind of just not use any of these methods. I'm not gonna detect my horizontal and vertical lines, just to show you how big of an effect it actually has on the curve. So if you're not detecting this grid, I'm just going to click OK here, give it the first point right here. Let's scroll down to here and give it the second point. So this blue line that you see is the tracker trying to find the curve, and it does a fair job of it. It's trying to stay true to the curve as much as it can, but every so often it kind of off on this horizontal line, goes down this vertical line, comes back. So depending on the quality of your image, the prominence of your curve, you're going to get varying results on how the tracker kind of behaves when it has these horizontal and vertical lines to contend with as well. So that's kind of obviously not wanted. It's a lot of work trying to go in and fix all of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo these 2 points that I gave it, go back to my configuration options, and this time I'm going to use a grid removal method. I prefer the machine learning method because it works really well. Even if the image is not perfectly straightened, we have trained it this way so that it can very easily identify grid lines. Switch to my machine learning model, click OK here, and then do the same thing. Pick one point here and maybe down here. And this time, the curve, because the tracker cannot see, sorry, that was a misclick here. Because the tracker cannot see the grid lines anymore, it basically ignores them. It kind of goes down and follows the curve as closely as possible, and you can kind of keep going down, adding these points here. It's going to keep adding to that curve. In fact, let's scroll all the way down and just add a point right down here, and the tracker will, it's going to take a second or two because it is a long curve that you're trying to track here, but when it's done, you'll see that it follows that curve really well. Again, now here, probably because of the poor quality of the logs, you get a little bit of an issue here. It's not following where it needs to follow, even though it can't see the vertical lines, but it didn't really, it found more value in jumping from this point to here rather than following this curve here. And that's an easy fix, actually. So whenever you come across a situation like this where the tracker is not following the curve or following something else, all you need to do is go in here and say, hey, don't go down this path, the path that you selected. In fact, I need you to make sure that you follow this little thing here. So just click on the path you want it to take, and the tracker will correct the curve. It'll leave that path and it'll actually follow the path you intended to follow. So you keep going up, you keep QCing it, and you can see the tracker's done a pretty remarkable job of going to go in there and following that gamma ray curve as we wanted it. But I know that if we keep going up here, like right over here, it's also made some mistakes over here. Again, probably because this line is very hard to see even by the naked eye, so the machine kind of doesn't, the algorithm doesn't kind of see it. There's a couple of wraparounds that we have to contend with. And this is, again, you could kind of click around here and try to make it follow that path. But there's other ways to do it as well, which, combined with your manual tools, make it very easy to digitize your curve. So again, the first thing you have to remember is that this blue line, this bright blue line, is actually temporary pics. These are not fixed pics. These are not. So if you try to save your curve now, none of this is going to make into your database because these are not actual pics yet. Because the auto tracker lets you decide whether you want to keep these pics or not. To make these pics permanent, I must commit them. So I must say, hey, make these into permanent pics. I like them, so I'm going to right click here and say commit my pics. And that now is the actual curve that when I save to the database will go into the database. Now here though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, so this is obviously a mistake here. It should have been following this and down this path here, and there's like a little bit of a wrap here that we need to contend with as well, this one as well, and these two obvious wraps as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch to one of my manual modes, right? And this time I'm just going to say, hey, instead of first let's kind of get rid of the points that the tracker added just by using the erase tool, and then turn on one of the modes again and say, no, I need you to follow this one, then I need you to follow here and here and here, and that is my actual curve right here. This one that has been done okay to collect. Then we go back to our wrap scale, and we just say when you kind of reach the edge of the track here, this is where the curve goes, and we just add a few points to show where the wrap curve goes. You could keep going. If you could see the log kind of wrapping around again, poking its head out of here as well. You could go to a second order wrap scale as well and kind of do that here as well. Same thing here. There's once it reaches the end, make sure that we are in the wrap scale. Add points here. Sorry about that. Let's put this all back here. Yeah, so once we have that here, we're just going to say, okay, go from here to here, from here to here. That's our wrap. Like, maybe let's just make it a little smooth here, and that's going to be our wrapped curve as well. You can also use the auto tracker. So with the wrap scale turned on, let me go back to my auto tracker, make sure my grid detection is turned on, click OK here, and then I can just add some points here, and that is going to kind of track that little bit of curve over here. Now again, when I'm doing auto tracking in segments, I must commit this pix, because if I try to kind of track this without committing it, the tracker is going to try to find a path to connect this dot to the second curve as well. So I commit the pix, and then kind of go ahead and track this other bit as well, commit those pix, and that's kind of how I keep going and tracking my curves. Once I'm happy with the entire curve, I can give it a name, units if you want, and now you're going to push it into the database. So when I hit save now, it is going to take this curve and it's going to save it into the curve set that I've selected here. All the curve sets that you have in the well are listed here. If you want, you can create a new one as well. And now I have a gamma ray curve, a digital version of my gamma ray curve saved into the database. And that's how quick and great it is. I'll admit that this was a pretty simple case. One curve, pretty prominent on a single track, but the tracker can handle many other scenarios as well. I'm going to highlight one of those to you. So let's go down here to the second image, and you'll see I've got like a couple of logs over here as well, going down. There's the gamma ray. Let's kind of go down to the curve scale. There's the caliper as well, which is this one here as well. So let's kind of see how we can go ahead and pick that, right? So here's my straightened image here. I'm going to turn on my log curve. First things first, I give my edges of my track. I'm going to go from 6 to 16 because that's the scale of my caliper curve that I'm trying to track. Here's that caliper curve. It's like a dotted line, and it is kind of crisscrossing the gamma ray curve quite a lot. So what I'm going to do here then is turn on my auto tracker, make sure I have my grid line removal option turned on, and I'm going to start with this maximum average algorithm, which is basically prioritizing the brightness of the curve, the prominence of the curve, and we're going to click OK here. We're going to put this point right here, scroll down to let's say over here, and add that, and now it's going to do its thing. It's going to try to track it, and it does track it here, but it kind of prefers that gamma ray because that's a more prominent curve. So how do we fix that? Again, remember, every time it makes a bad decision, it found value enough that even couldn't see this horizontal line. It wanted to go from here straight to that prominent curve. It didn't see any value continuing down here. So to fix it, all I need to do is kind of click on the curve that I want it to go along, right? Just like in the previous example. But when I do click on it, it is still not enough because the other curve is just much more prominent that the tracker really wants to go down that path. So this is where those algorithms kind of come into play, right? So once you have a situation like this, all you need to do is go to your parameters. So I'm just going to kind of undo these picks here. I'm going to go to my configuration. I'm going to change the algorithm to minimum distance. So instead of kind of preferring the brightness or the prominence of the curve, it's going to look to minimize the shortest distance there. I click OK, and I do the same thing. I kind of go from here. Let's keep going down to up here, and now it's still kind of preferring the gamma ray a little bit, but you can see that it's not kind of the value of jumping from this curve to this curve has diminished already. So it's kind of followed this along, and then when it came into an intersection, that's when it kind of changed path. But now to fix it, all I need to do is click here, and that's going to stop following that gamma ray curve. So a little bit of more manual involvement here in this particular case, but certainly a lot better than kind of going down and trying to track that entire curve by hand. So let's kind of keep going down there. Again, if you prefer, you could, for some sections of it, just use the manual method to do address. But let me just kind of keep adding some of these points here until we get to the curve that we need to get at. Okay, just a few clicks, keep going here. And remember, this is a dotted line, and it is doing a pretty decent job of tracking this dotted line and coming up with that caliber curve. And of course, we kind of keep going down and keep tracking this curve as we go until we are at the end of our end of the curve that we want to digitize. Once this is done, we will again commit our picks and then choose a curve set. Let's call it caliper. Give it its units, should be inches. Hit save, and now that curve is now also saved into the database. Again, I kind of missed that here, so you can always go ahead and correct that by just using one of your manual methods. Hit save again because you need to update this curve over here, and I'll update my existing curve, and that is going to fix that a little bit for me in my database as well. Again, so this was a couple of overlapping curves. Now, what about when you have really poor quality logs? And again, I have an example of that on that first image. So if I go back here for this resistivity, the shallow resistivity is this dotted line, the deep resistivity is this dark line. So if you look at it here, this is really poor quality. Let's say I want to track this dotted line going right through here. So how does the tracker or the digitization tool in general handle data like this? Well, the first thing I have to do, of course, is to identify the edges of my track again. So I'm just going to reset everything because it's still stuck to that gamma ray curve. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, hey, this is my left edge. Let's give it a value of 0. This is my right edge. Let's give that a value of 2000. And this time I'm going to switch this to logarithmic because this is a logarithmic track. Turn on my auto tracker. Make sure that I have my grid line removal settled out. Now, when you're tracking this, it's very hard to kind of go ahead and find this curve all along. But for the most part, they're running pretty close to each other. So I can, still track this curve, and then when I need to, go ahead and change my auto tracker settings so that I'm looking after, or I'm tracking the curve that I actually want to track. I'm going to leave this as maximum average. Click OK here. Put the first point here. Let's track it all the way down to, let's say, over here, where we have our first kind of split happening between the deep and the shallow resistivity. Goes along. It's for the most part, it's doing a good enough job. Doesn't do it so well over here, so we kind of change that to here. Add another click to go that here. Same thing here and here. So you kind of go down, look at where the changes are. Now here, I have significant changes, and this is kind of like a very broken line, but when I add a click here, it does kind of follow that path that I needed to. Another thing that I might want to do here is kind of change my tracking algorithm to minimum distance so it actually follows this path much better. In fact, let's do that. I'm going to commit these picks here because I'm pretty happy with them. Change this to minimum distance, click OK, and then kind of redo some of these sections so that it's following that dotted line a little better here. Let's commit this as well. Go here, commit that as well. Right, so that gives us a pretty deep track. Now this one, I'm just going to go from here, let's say down here. It's going to follow that broken line. We'll happily track on to, let's say, down here where we have the other major split happening between the two lines. And then we just kind of go down here, click here, and that's going to try to follow that. It does miss some parts of it, so we just kind of correct that with a couple of clicks, and kind of we keep going down and adding the stuff that we need to add, and we get our curve. Once we're happy with it, again, we commit these picks, choose the curves that we want to add them to. Let's just call it, this is shallow resistivity. I'm going to call it RS. Give it the units that you need. I mean, you don't have to give the units as well, and that's going to save your curve into the database. So there you have it. Log Curve Digitization enhanced with auto tracking. That works really well, gels into your existing workflows pretty well. Works on, pretty poor quality logs as well. Now, one of the questions that I get pretty often when I present this to people is that does it work on colored raster images? Yes, it certainly does. It will take, because when we send the image to the tracker, we binarize it. Essentially, that means that we change it into a black and white image, just black and white, two colors on it. So so when the tracker runs, it's agnostic to color values. So it's not gonna see colored lines or treat them separately. So it's gonna do it to a pretty good job of that as well. All of this is already out in the 2023 version, ORION, which we released earlier this month. If you haven't upgraded yet, I strongly urge you to do so. Give this a shot. Send us your feedback. Let us know if it's helping you. Let us know how we can improve it, and we'd certainly love to make it, even more powerful in the releases to come. Thank you very much. And with that, it's back to Christina.